Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be section 6.1, our first lecture of the chapter. We're going to look at some habitats and what the difference between that and a niche is, and just how some species interact with each other in an ecosystem. So first off, looking at what a habitat is. A habitat is simply just kind of the area that an organism lives in and how its population lives in that area. So we're kind of looking at the different physical and biological factors that affect where that organism lives. So just looking at kind of this population of bears and what physical types of factors they might need in their environment for where they're going to live. Obviously, these guys aren't going to live in an African safari, so there's different factors that cause them to live where they live, and that's simply their habitat. Now, we have what's called tolerance, and tolerance is going to have an effect on where an individual's habitat is. Tolerance is simply the range of external conditions with where a species can survive and reproduce. So it's very important that a species not only survives, but also that it's able to reproduce, because that's what keeps that species going. So we have to look at, there's a range of tolerance or a range of conditions in which a species is going to survive best in and be able to reproduce in. If we go outside of that range, okay, then those organisms become more stressed, and eventually those organisms hit outside of that tolerance range enough where they no longer can survive. Okay, so a really good example of looking at a tolerance range would be the temperature for an organism in the habitat they live in. There's going to be an optimal range, a perfect temperature in which they live in, but then there's going to be temperatures where either they're too low or too high, where the organism becomes more stressed, and eventually that temperature could get too low or too high, and it could cause that organism to die. So the range of tolerance is just kind of their best environment that they can live in. Now, the niche is a little bit different than the habitat. So the niche, when we talk about a species niche, that's going to include the physical and biological conditions, just like the habitat, but it's also going to include how they obtain their resources. So not only are we looking at the habitat that that species lives in, but we're also looking at how that species lives in that habitat and how do they obtain resources like water and nutrients and light and food and space. So the niche not only looks at the habitat, but also looks at really kind of how they actually live in that area. When we look at some community interactions, really what we're going to look at is just how different populations of organisms interact with each other within a community. So we're going to look at some various types of interactions. We're going to look at competition. We're going to look at something called resource partitioning. We're going to look at, again, the relationship between predators and prey. We're going to look at something that's called the keystone species. And lastly, we're going to look at what are called symbiotic relationships. So these are all different ways that populations within a community can interact with each other. So when we first look at our first interaction, we're looking at competition. So competition, usually we completely understand because we ourselves are competitive people. We compete for things all the time. So it's the same idea within any other population, right, and within a community. Organisms can attempt to use the same resources and therefore cause competition, where they can go ahead and fight and compete for that resource. Now, there's two different types of competition. There's what we call intra-specific competition, and that's going to be competition between members of the same species. So these two birds both fighting for that food source. They're of the same species. That is intra-specific competition. They're both the same species, both fighting for that resource. Okay. The other type of competition is inter-specific competition, and that's where we have competition between members of different species. So you might have two completely different species that are maybe competing for a resource. So you might have a moose and a bear competing for space or food or shelter or water. Okay, so intra, the same species, inter, different species competing. Now, we have what's called the competitive exclusion principle, and this strictly comes from the idea that species, in fact, do compete with each other. Okay, and this principle states that no two species can occupy the exact same niche. So they can't occupy exactly the same habitat and getting all the exact same resources, okay, because eventually the competition is going to become so extreme that one will die, but the other one that's going to lose is likely going to die. Okay, the one that wins is going to win those resources, but the one that is going to lose that competition likely ends up dying. So that's kind of what this competitive exclusion principle is it's just stating that no two species can be in the exact same habitat and living in the exact same niche and getting the exact same resources because the competition is going to become so great that one will end up dying. Okay, this graph here is looking at two different organisms and how their population does when they're living alone versus when they're living together. So when they're living together, you'll notice that both of their population numbers are lower versus when they are living alone. When each species is living alone, their populations thrive a little bit better and their population numbers increase. But once they're put together, both of their numbers end up dropping some. Now, what happens is we can have an interaction that allows for some dividing up of resources. So instead of always allowing competition to occur and then causing maybe a species to leave, we can sometimes have what's called resource partitioning. And that just means that we're going to divide up those resources. So individuals within that community, they're going to divide up different areas of a niche to go ahead and best suit their environment and best suit their needs so that they no longer are having to compete. Okay, so this helps go ahead and reduce competition with species of their own as well as different species. Okay, so this helps reduce competition. So if you look at the diagram here, you have three different warblers, and the Cape May warbler is going to take kind of this area of the tree. The bay-breasted warbler is going to take the middle portion of the tree, and the yellow-rumped warbler is going to take the bottom portion of the tree. So they're going to go ahead and create their own niches within just that one tree. And again, that's going to help reduce competition, reduce fighting, and reduce the chances of them ultimately losing that competition and dying. Now, predator and prey relationship, we just talked about this in chapter 5. Okay, looking at how the predator's population and how the prey's population can affect each other's numbers, okay, and just how much they interact with each other. So things we talked about back in chapter 5 that also apply to this interaction. Okay, if our prey, if their population numbers are very high, that's going to allow for our predator population to go very high because the predators are going to have more than enough food to eat. So they're going to be really in a good spot with their resources. Okay. However, what's going to happen is if those predators, their numbers are really high and they're going to be eating so much of the prey, over time, that's going to cause our prey to drop and decrease in numbers, okay, because they're eating too much of the prey. Okay. And then again, if their numbers start dropping, that's going to eventually cause the predators' numbers to drop because they're not going to have enough food and they might start starving. So just like the graphs we looked at in the last chapter, okay, look at this idea that as one affects the other and how those interactions can really cause a change in each other's species and their population numbers. Now, keystone species is a really interesting interaction. So first off, looking at the idea of what a keystone is. So where they get the idea from is if you think of an archway, okay, and you think of an old arch and it has these different stones that make this arch. What there is there is always what's called a keystone. The keystone is the stone that is right in the center of that archway. And what would happen is if that stone were to be removed, the rest of the arch would actually end up starting to crumble and fall because that keystone is just like how it sounds. It holds structure, stability, allows for diversity, okay? It allows for that entire structure to withhold the stress that it's having on itself with that archway. So in an ecosystem, it's the same way. Sometimes we have a species that is so vital and so important to that ecosystem's stability that we call it a keystone. Okay, and a perfect example of that are sea otters. Okay, sea otters are a really great example of keystone species, because what sea otters do is they like to eat these guys. Okay, they like to eat what are called sea urchins. So super, super important. They help control the sea urchin population. Now, why that's so important is because sea urchins love, 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 love to eat kelp. Okay. So if the sea urchin population was not being controlled by the otters, the sea urchin population would be so large and they would be eating so much of the kelp in that ecosystem that all of these other organisms here in that ecosystem that rely on the kelp for food or for shelter for their habitats, okay, they wouldn't have any kelp to go ahead and use. So the sea otters are really important in this ecosystem. They help control that sea urchin population, which then in turn helps control the kelp population. Okay, if those otters were removed, the sea urchin population would increase way too much, which would then cause the kelp to really decrease because they would be eating so much of it. And that would cause all of these other organisms that are within that ecosystem to be negatively impacted. They wouldn't have food, they wouldn't have a habitat to live in, and such. So they really are that keystone of that ecosystem. Now, the last type of interaction we're going to look at are what are called symbiotic relationships. Okay, symbiotic just means that there's a relationship in which two species live really close together. And sometimes we see a positive, okay, a beneficial effect from that relationship. Sometimes we see a negative effect, and sometimes we see no effect at all. Okay, there's absolutely no effect at all. So we're going to look at these three different types of relationships: mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. Each one has a little bit different of an effect on those two species that are within that relationship, but you'll see they live closely together and there's a reason why. So first off, mutualism. Okay, mutualism is a cooperative relationship between two species. Okay, and both are going to get some type of benefit from that relationship. So species one is going to receive a benefit, they're going to have a positive impact, and species two is going to have a positive impact as well. Okay, perfect example would be bees and the flowers in which they pollinate. Okay, both are getting a positive impact here. The bees are getting their food source and the flowers are being pollinated so that they can reproduce. Okay. These guys are also a mutualistic relationship. These guys are called oxpeckers, these little birds. Okay. And then we have our zebras, and they also go ahead and work with other animals, other grazing animals. So what they do is these oxpeckers, they get a positive beneficial relationship by going ahead and hanging out on these animals because they eat all of the ticks off of the animals, so they get some food. Now the zebra or the other animals that they go ahead and sit on are also getting a positive relationship because these birds are removing ticks from them that could possibly make them sick. So realistically, both are getting some type of benefit out of their relationship. Okay, so whenever it's mutualism, both end up getting a positive or a benefit from that relationship. Now, commensalism, the second type of a symbiotic relationship, is where one species benefits, so one gets something positive, and the other is completely unaffected. There's no effect at all. Okay, nobody gets hurt, nobody gets helped. They really usually don't even know that that other species is using them for a benefit. A perfect example would be these guys here. These guys are white egrets, and they work with other grazing animals all the time. And what they do is, as these guys are grazing, they're going to be knocking up different insects that are living in the grasses, and then these guys get to eat those insects. So the grazers, the cows, the buffalo, the ox, whatever they may be, they don't really even care that those birds are there. They're not doing anything to hurt them. They're just grazing and eating their food. But as they're doing that, they're knocking up those insects, and these little cute white birds are getting the food from them. So again, the birds here, they're getting that positive relationship, but our grazers, there's no effect at all. It doesn't hurt them, doesn't help them. They don't even care. Okay. Another good example of commensalism are whales and barnacles. So whales have barnacles on them that kind of attach, and they don't hurt the whales in any way, so the whales don't have any effect at all. But what's good for the barnacles is that they're able to get a food source. So as the whales are swimming around, the barnacles are able to go ahead and filter out little bits of food, little organisms in the ocean, and they're able go ahead and get that food source. So the barnacles, they're getting the positive relationship. And the whales, again, they don't even really know they're there. It's no effect, not hurting them. But those barnacles get some food out of it. So that's, again, kind of a commensalism type relationship. Someone gets a benefit, the other one isn't affected in any way. The last type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. Okay, so a parasitism type relationship is where one individual is harmed, so they have a negative impact on them, and then the other individual is going to benefit, so that one is getting a positive impact. So if you've ever heard of a parasite's usually a really bad thing. A parasite is an organism that feeds on another individual. Okay, so the parasite attaches itself to what we call a host, and they start pulling all of the nutrients from that host, and that's how they get their food and their energy and things. So a very common parasite that we talk about are ticks. Okay, you guys have heard of ticks, I'm sure, before. Depending on where you might go, you might have to check yourself and make sure you haven't had a tick attached to your skin. You might check your dogs for ticks. This, unfortunately, is an extremely neglected dog that has kind of ticks all covered within its ears. And ticks can carry diseases that they can transfer to their host, as well as they can pull nutrients out from that host and go ahead and make them sick as well. Okay, another parasite is what's called a parasitic wasp. And what these wasps do is they lay all of their eggs onto caterpillars, and all these eggs now are going to start pulling the nutrients out of this caterpillar so that they can grow and develop into an adult wasp. Okay, and eventually what happens is they pull out so many nutrients that caterpillar ends up dying, and they themselves are able to develop into the adult version wasp. So that's another really good version of a parasitic relationship. So the wasp eggs, they have a positive because they're getting their food source, they're able to grow and develop. But that caterpillar, it has a negative effect because it's losing its nutrients, its energy, because it is being kind of preyed upon and eaten upon by that parasite. Okay, so just another relationship that we see happening with different populations. But that does it for our notes. If you have questions, make sure to ask in class. Otherwise, we are good to move on to our next section.